Welcome, dear friends, both in person and online. It's the first Sunday since March 8th that we've had any in-person worshipers. It's much different than what we might have expected. We're spaced apart, we're wearing masks, we're humming or listening to music rather than singing. We're still missing many of our friends that would normally be here in person. Many of them are with us online, and we are grateful for that. We have those online, dozens of people worshiping with us online, and we have the privilege of being in two places at one time, which is always something I've had a hard time doing. I'm deeply grateful for you being here, and for all of you who are watching online and joining us during this service. Allow me, before we get into the text this morning, allow me to say a couple of words of gratitude to two or three groups of people. First of all, to some folks that you have not seen things happening over the last 14 weeks. There have been people in this building on Sundays and on Saturdays making sure that we had worship services available online during the whole time of this pandemic. There are people who we have worked with reduced personnel. There are people who have figured out lighting and music and sound, and they figured out sound both for in the room and online, because those are two very different things. They have figured out how to manage the bandwidth in that room. And if you don't know what that means, I really don't either. But I just know that when the bandwidth's higher, it works, and when the bandwidth's lower, it doesn't. We've had to adjust and pivot more times, English and Spanish, than we can say. And many of these people who've been doing this with us were not staff people, they were volunteers. So to those folks, that Saturday and Sunday group from the past 14 weeks who have done the improbable and something that in many ways looked impossible 14 weeks ago, I want to say thank you. I'm thankful to God for your expertise, your sacrifice, and your willingness to change when we had to, which seemed like it happened every week. Our church's family as a whole will never know or understand all the hours that were sacrificed there. But I do. And I want those folks, I want to thank them. And I want to thank the folks, particularly our Emergency Management Ministry Action Team, which is Emma for short. Those folks were formed and came together, and those folks are the ones who are handling the hosting duties for the time being. They've been specially trained, they have learned special things, and once we get out of this pandemic season, that action team, that Emma team, will still exist, but they will just be ready for the next emergency. Lord help us, I hope we don't have another one of these. But, there could be a hurricane, there could be something else, and it's good to have that team already formed and ready. Thank you, folks, for learning to host in a different way. Thank you for being willing to set things up. Chris Guys, Ken Evans, thank y'all so much for coordinating and making this happen. It's so essential for this time. To our ministerial and our church staff, I have been astounded by you these last 14 weeks. I was astounded by you anyway. But the amount of servanthood and sacrifice and willingness to do things differently that you've displayed has simply been beyond anything that could be imagined. I am so grateful and blessed to serve with you folks, and to serve as your teammate. You have my deepest admiration and gratitude. I have never served on a team like this. You were the right team for this season. And now here we are at the beginning of the next phase of this season, which is not over. We are in the next phase of this season, and I've been thinking about this day where at least some of us return to in-person worship, while we still have our online congregation worshiping with us. I've been thinking about this day since, about March 15th, the first Sunday we were online only. And my expectations for this day have changed a lot over this time, but my constant companion on this day, thinking about this day, has been a guy named Ezra. Anybody remember Ezra in the Bible? Ezra's story, if you read Ezra and Nehemiah, they both go together. The chronology of it is very hard to figure out because it jumps back and forth. But Ezra tells a story that is very apropos to where we are right now. So I want us to spend some time away from Luke for a week, and I want us to look at Ezra chapter 3. But let's get a little bit of background. Ezra and Nehemiah, they tell the story of the return of the people of Israel from exile. Now, I don't want to go too deep into history here. You can study some of this yourself, but they were exiled from the land of Judah and Jerusalem in 586 BC. Ezra the priest was finally allowed to return to Jerusalem about 50 years later, 538 BC, and he was allowed to take a group of 42,000 Jewish people from Persia back to Jerusalem. Now, the people did not really win their freedom. King Cyrus, who was the king of the Persian Empire at that point, said, you know what, y'all can go back. It was politically expedient for him to send captured peoples back to where their homeland was, so that they could still be vassals, but also have some degree, some sense of freedom. So these 42,000 were sent back, not fully free, but released to return to a semblance of their old life. The story of how they returned to Jerusalem and how they returned to worship, the beginning piece of that, is the ground we're going to plow for just a little bit today. It's in Ezra chapter 3, and we're going to start with verse 6. On the first day of the 7th month, the people of the Lord began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not been laid. Then the people gave money to the masons and carpenters, and they gave food and drink and oil to people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by the king Cyrus, the king of Persia. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of their brothers, the priests and the Levites, and all who had returned from the captivity to Jerusalem, began the work. They appointed Levites 20 years of age and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. Yeshua and his sons and brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, descendants of Hodaviah, and the sons of Henadad and their sons and brothers, all Levites joined together in supervising and working on the house of God. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and with their trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their places of praise to praise the Lord, as prescribed by David, king of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord. He is good, his love endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. For all of you who are online, and for those of you who are in person, I have a question for you. For you who are online, you may want to write your answer in the comments so that you can engage and understand what we're talking about. The question is this: can you think of a time when you've been exceedingly happy and exceedingly sad at the same time? Can you think of a time when you've been exceedingly happy and exceedingly sad at the same time? Randy, that sounds impossible. Well, no, it's not. Think about it. I remember the day my mom dropped me off at college. I was so excited to get going, and then she pulled away. I cried for about 10 minutes. It was very sad. And then I went on. Those kind of moments in your life. Times when you were happy, exceedingly happy, and exceedingly sad at the same time. And just for those of you online, write that down in the comment section. For those of you in the room, think about it a little bit, ponder that. Maybe write it down on a piece of paper that you brought with you or on your phone, something of that nature. Now, the story of the crowd under Ezra's leadership is something I want to talk about for just a few minutes. I want to talk about this whole episode. because this is a very instructive and inspirational story for me at this time in my life, at this time in our lives as a people of God. We learn a few things out of the story. First thing we learn is that in desperate and dangerous times, we must reframe and refocus our faith. In desperate, dangerous times, we must reframe and refocus our faith. What we learn from these followers of God who returned from the exile is that everything was different. There were 42,000 of them walking into a city that could house at least twice that many. It was in ruins. They had spent 7 months building homes for themselves. And then, what we just read, they started doing the acts of worship, the sacrifices, without even a temple being present. They had to do the sacrifices on the altar. They had to build an altar without anything present to actually worship in. They had no sanctuary. They had to figure it all out. Everything was different. Now, their fathers and grandfathers, mothers and grandmothers, the ones who had actually been sent out into exile, they had a real switch to figure out things that are different. I'm going to flip real quick and just read you something from Psalm 137. This is a psalm that was written during this time when the people of Israel, people of Jerusalem had fallen, and they were all taken off. Almost the entire population of the nation was taken off into captivity into Babylon. That would be the grandparents and the parents of the ones who have now returned. Psalm 137 says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion, Jerusalem. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked for songs, our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing to us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing the songs of the Lord while we're in a foreign land?" How do we sing God's song when we're depressed? How do we sing God's song when we're in despair? How do we sing God's song when we can't be in the sanctuary? How do we sing God's song when everything seems to have collapsed around us and then we have to try and put it back together again? What a haunting question. How do we sing the song of Zion in a foreign land? These people were in the middle of a theological abyss in their cultural understanding. The people with the strongest God won the battles and received the blessings. They had just been routed. They were taken into exile. And all sorts of thoughts were in their minds. We thought our God was strongest. How did we lose? How did we get in such a desperate situation? There were only two answers that they could come up with. Either one, God was not strong enough to deliver them, which their history told them was false, or two, God allowed them to be overwhelmed and overrun for some reason. And why would their God who loved them, who promised to always deliver them and be with them, why would God allow them to be defeated and his temple to be desecrated? The temple, by the way, was a big deal. Our sanctuary is a beautiful building where we gather for public worship. The temple of God was the place where God lived. It's the place where his glory resided. They had witnessed the house of their God destroyed. How do you sing a song of God when God no longer lives in his home? Some of them, friends, they never worshiped God again. They went to Babylon, learned the Babylonian culture, decided to follow the Babylonian gods, and that was their story. Some went to Babylon. They remembered some of the stories of God. They remembered the stories of God's faithfulness to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They remembered the story of God delivering the people out of Egypt through Moses. They remembered the stories of King David, but those stories were simply memories for them. They never acted on them again. They were too hurt, too unwilling to do the work of prayer and theological digging that it would require to rebuild and reframe and refocus their faith. Some of them, however, found a way to sing a song of God in a foreign land. There were some who found ways to pray, build community with one another in small groups, and worship God in new ways, even though they couldn't offer sacrifices at the temple, which was core to their belief system. As a matter of fact, one of the things we think is that it's perhaps that during this exile time that the synagogue was actually formed, or at least the small groups that became the antecedents of the synagogue were formed during this period. And that was the way they began to cope and began to worship. So that there was a people, when Ezra was ready, when Ezra was allowed to go back, there were people ready to go back. Friends, I want to point out something to you. We are at such a point in American culture. We are in an exile moment as the church. We are in an exile moment because of a pandemic that, for safety's sake, has kept us scattered. But we have found new ways to worship. We have found new ways to refocus our faith. We have found ways to use digital worship as a way that we can stay together. We have found ways to continue to grow deeper with God, even in the midst of putting on masks and having to take care of one another and having to take care of our families. We have found ways. And God has been faithful and brought the first parts of us back to in-person worship and has grown our online congregation in the midst of it. Friends, this is an exile situation. But it's not just because of a pandemic. Let me remind you that before the pandemic, there were multiple Americans that were not interested in going into our church buildings at all. There's a book that our staff and many of our church leaders are reading right now where the author actually states 50 to 60% of the people around us are not going to come to our church buildings as we know them, no matter how well we do things. They are not going to come to our church buildings. 50 to 60% of the American population. That was written in 2015. And now they've got another reason not to come to our church buildings. Larger group gatherings can become super spreader events, which is why we have taken so many precautions, researched so diligently, and made so many things happen, as we showed you in the video that was on Facebook this week and that was emailed out to you all. We're trying to be very careful. But friends, we need to understand, we are in an exile moment, but it's not a time of fear. It's a time of opportunity. It's a time of opportunity, friends, because God's love endures forever. God has not forgotten about us. God has not given up on us. God is still our God as a church family, regardless of whether there's 500 people in this room, 50, or somewhere in between, or somewhere greater, or somewhere lesser. God is still our God because we have congregations of people online. We have congregations of people sitting in this place. God has not left us. God's love for us extends forever, as He promised to the people of Israel. And now He promises to the people who have followed Israel's lead in accepting Jesus Christ, the Messiah, as their forgiver and leader of their lives. Our God has not left us. His love endures forever. And friends, God's people throughout the centuries have worshipped in all kinds of circumstances. They have worshipped when very few of them could gather because they would be arrested. They have worshipped when very few of them could gather because of war. They, our brothers and sisters, our foreparents in the faith, have worshipped even when they had to be in groups of only 2 or 3 to gather together, because that's all that could safely come together. Friends, we are not, even though we're in an exile moment, we are not in a defeated moment, because our God's reign and love for us is forever. It endures forever. This is not a season of fear. This is a season of opportunity. An opportunity for what? An opportunity to get to work. What we're told in this story is that after folks had built their homes and gotten those together, after they rebuilt the altar of the Lord, they came together to rebuild the foundation of the temple. And all of them, the Levites, the priests, everybody that came back, got together and started to do the work. Friends, the days of church as we used to know it, where 10% of the people did 90% of the work, where 20% of the people did 80% of the work, those days have got to be gone now, because all the work cannot happen in this building. It wasn't ever supposed to in the first place. We just kind of fell into that pattern. But a good portion of the work that the church does now is got to be outside of the walls by necessity. And it's a great thing, because that's who we're called to be. We're called to gather together the best we can for worship, and then we're called to be out in the culture, building friendships, building connections, and showing people the love of Jesus Christ in those places. We've got to get to work. How do we get to work when we can't even gather together? Well, friends, all the work isn't going to be done in here. In this pandemic season, for who knows how many more months, I have no idea. Most of the work is not going to be done in here. It's going to be done by believers on the phone, by believers in Zoom, by believers getting together wearing masks and sitting in small group gatherings outside on decks and on porches. It's going to be believers reaching out to their lost and unchurched neighbors and beginning to build relationships with them in as safe a way as possible. The church is going to go back to being the church, or it's going to die, and different kinds of churches are going to sprout up. Because the church gathers together, yes. But even when we can't gather, even when we can't gather the way we like, we are called to be scattered. We are called to be out. We've got to build the church in three ways. We've got to build the gathered church, which means we've got to make it as safe as possible to worship in this space so that people who feel comfortable and are not at risk can gather. Now, friends, we can't guarantee that it's 100% safe in here. We have done all we can. But friends, there is no 100% safe environment. You took a risk being here this morning. Those of you in person. You took a risk that not everybody could take. That does not make you superior in any way or me superior in any way. It's something you were able to do. And we've made it as safe as we possibly can for you. But there is no place that is 100% safe from this virus. That's not fear, that's being careful. So friends, we have to understand that this room is not going to be full for quite a while, because we have many of our members who are in at-risk categories. So we have to make it as safe as we can to gather, but we have to take care of our gathered ones on the phone. We have to take care of them via letters. We've got to take care of them with Facebook messages and emails and text. We've got to take care of them however we can. Our gathered people. Thank you so much for calling your Sunday school class members, for checking in on people that are homebound. Thank you so much for doing those things. We've got to keep doing